All right, everybody. Thank you all for gathering today on this wonderful day. This is our Big Questions, Big Ideas. I am Joe, a reference librarian here at Muncie Public Library's Kennedy branch. Today we have various different amounts of panelists to be discussing pandemic sport regarding how the COVID-19 pandemic has impacted all areas of our lives, including the world of sport. I'd like to introduce everyone. Welcome, Dr. Nicholas Dixon. Dr. Chad Carlson and Dr. Jeffrey P. Fry as our panelists for today. And our moderator, Dr. Kevin Harrelson. How's everybody doing today?
Wonderfully. Thank you, Joe. Thank you again for hosting. I'm Kevin Harrelson from the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies at Ball State University, who co-hosts this series with Joe Nelson and the Muncie Public Library. So we are here to celebrate our guests who have published a forthcoming book, or who have a forthcoming book entitled Philosophy, Sport, and the Pandemic. So we're going to give each of the three panelists 10 or 15 minutes to introduce their thoughts about sport and the pandemic, specifically as it pertains to the volume that they have forthcoming. And then we'll have some questions and conversation among the panelists. So we're going to start here with Nick Dixon. Welcome to Muncie, if only virtually, Nick.
Thank you very much, and I really appreciate you organizing this. This is a fantastic idea. So my paper is on high school sport and the pandemic, and I wrote this over the last winter. And what's remarkable is how quickly things change. And so some of what I wrote really, in fact, my whole paper really applies primarily to the pre-pandemic situation, or excuse me, to the pre-vaccine situation. And I think that some of what I've written will not be nearly as applicable now that we do have a vaccine. But I don't think that the advent of a vaccine completely ends questions about participation in sport. Because as we know, breakthrough cases happen. I have several of my students this term at Alma College have had breakthrough cases. They're vaccinated, but they got it. And furthermore, vaccine uptake is far from universal. Here in Gratiot County, where I live, the vaccine rate, fully vaccinated rate is less than 50%. And that's even before we started to include 5-year-olds and up. This is even including just people who are 16 and up. It's less than 50%. So there still is a real issue about anything that brings people into close contact. But anyway, if I would just briefly give some empirical background, I think that I don't need to repeat too much about the mode of transmission that we're only too familiar with. We know that the risk of transmission in sport is much greater in contact sport than it is in other sports. The risk is greater in highly aerobic sports because we're exhaling really hard, and the risk is greater in indoor sports. What happened in spring of 2020 in Michigan, like in many other states, is Michigan stopped high school sport. They just put a dead halt to it. And then in the summer, it started to let it start, but with a lot of restrictions. Some of the restrictions included face masks. It included limited travel. There were no regional preseason tournaments in high school sport. And there were a very limited number of spectators that were allowed. One very important thing that you do have to take into account, so primarily my paper is an evaluation of sport really since around about summer 2020 until the beginning of the vaccination being widely available. So really until winter of 2021. One thing that I observed back in the fall of 2020, I went to a lot of soccer games because both my sons played high school soccer, is that many players wore face masks, which were required, completely improperly. Few players covered their noses. Several players actually wore their face mask around their chin. So it really wasn't a face mask. So that has to be taken into account. And as we know, lack of compliance with various anti-COVID measures has become a badge of honor for some people. And I think it certainly was there. And it doesn't just apply to the players, some of the fans as well. In fact, many fans, I think, fell into that category. So I consider, first of all, one argument in favor of restrictions, because I do think we have to talk about restrictions on sport. And the first type of argument I consider is our paternalistic arguments. And I think that the most plausible type of paternalism is soft paternalism, which is paternalism restricting people's freedom for their own benefit in the case where their decision isn't entirely autonomous, where there is something that is lacking, it's not a fully competent decision. After all, even adults make some decisions that, that are not fully autonomous, and people need to be protected from them. The three criteria for autonomy that I raise are, first of all, an autonomous decision must be based on complete information or adequate information. Secondly, it's got to be freely made without coercion by others. And finally, it's got to be the result of sufficient reflection on values rather than being a hasty decision. So the question really is, how do these criteria apply to 14 to 18-year-old high school athletes deciding whether to play sport? So let's first of all talk a little bit about knowledge. Do high school students have sufficient knowledge about COVID? Well, in terms of detailed scientific knowledge, no. But I think it's the same thing applies to many adults deciding whether to smoke cigarettes or to drink alcohol. The average drinker or smoker does not have very good knowledge about the actual bodily effects. What they do know is that smoking and drinking a lot can be bad for you. Similarly, I think high school kids know that COVID-19 is pretty dangerous. Now, granted, there's a lot of disinformation and denialism, but I think it's hard to be unaware of the sort of widely held view that COVID is very dangerous. So I don't think that we can say that high school kids are so unaware of the risks of COVID that they can't make an autonomous decision. Are they acting freely and without coercion? That seems to be important. There's a lot of pressure on kids to play. I'm sure it's the same in all of the towns or the cities where you are all resident. High school sport is huge in the US, more than any other country. High school football games are the biggest event in my town. Hundreds of people go there. Hundreds of people don't go to anything other than the football games. And so there's a lot of pressure from the local community. I think there's pressure from parents. I think there's peer pressure too. Kids don't want to let their teammates down. So if they're a little bit worried about catching COVID or passing it on, they might still go ahead and do it because they don't want to let other people down. But I don't think that that's enough reason to say that the average high school athlete is not making what you might call an authentic decision that's their own. It seems to me that the vast majority of high school athletes' motivation is internal. They wouldn't do all the training they have to do for sport if they didn't love sport. So I don't think we can claim that they're being pushed into it against their will. In fact, the protests in Michigan against the lockdown on sport back in the spring and the summer were primarily led by athletes, high school athletes and their parents. Probably the best case you can make for high school athletes not making an autonomous decision would be my third criterion, sufficient reflection on values. And even someone who's fully informed and is not being coerced by anybody else might still make a hasty decision that doesn't reflect their lasting values. There's lots of examples from medical ethics of that kind of decision. Teens are notorious risk takers who don't necessarily think about the dangers that they're running into. And maybe they fall at the third hurdle to autonomy. But it turns out, I did some research on this with the help of a colleague from psychology. I read some articles about teens and risk taking. It turns out that it's a myth that teens are unaware of danger. In fact, teens tend to overestimate danger. It's just completely counterintuitive. Where teens maybe fall short is not in their assessment of risk, but rather in having realized that an activity is risky, they do it anyway. They don't actually advert to the risk in their behavior. It's not an effective motivator for their behavior. So you could say what they suffer from more than most people is temporal myopia. They just focus on what they want to do now. They don't think about what could happen down the line. While this is very real, I am always reluctant to use a lack of reflection on values as an argument in favor of paternalism, because I think there's a danger of what I call moral chauvinism. When I look at someone who does activities that I would never dream of doing, like trying to climb Mount Everest, I think you're crazy. You're doing something that's way too dangerous. It's really important to live a long life. But a mountaineer is going to tell me, no, I know the dangers, but I value living on the edge and pushing myself. And it would be arrogant of me to assume that they haven't thought through their values. I think reflection on values is a process rather than an end product. And so I'm going to say the same thing about high school athletes. I don't think we can declare that your typical high school athlete has not reflected on their values. So I don't think we can get from paternalism an argument in favor of restricting high school sport. So I think we've got to look elsewhere. But the good news is it's not very far that we have to look, because staring us in the face is the most obvious argument in favor of any kind of restriction on people's behavior, and that is Mill's harm principle. It seems to me that by far the best reason for restricting high school sport is that it involves harm to other people. Now, that's relatively innocuous when it comes to the effects, the dangers of high school sport that are visited upon other people who consent. So if I play football and the fact that I might have COVID could result in my affecting the players on the other team, maybe that's not so problematic because they're aware of the risk and they chose to run the risk anyway. And you could say similar things about the other people at athletic events who are also at risk of either catching COVID or passing on COVID. You know, the coaches, the concession stand workers, the athletic trainers, and the fans. They all choose to be there. They know that there is a risk and they choose to run it. So I think that the anti-paternalistic argument that I just looked at before would probably cover the risk to other consensual participants at the event, not just the athletes, but the people who choose to go there. The argument that I make in my paper in favor of restrictions, in fact, the restrictions that Michigan made, where I think were pretty good back in last summer, is the risk of collateral damage to people who don't consent. And that's not too difficult to find. Now, this is not unique to sport. This is certainly going to occur in any kind of activity when large groups of people get together and happen during the pandemic. And again, I'm talking about the pre-vaccine era, even though I think it's still somewhat applicable now. The defining feature of a pandemic is that it's hard to confine its spread. That's what makes it a pandemic. You can't just keep the cold that you earned just to you and maybe a couple of other people in your house. A pandemic means when something spreads easily. And the problem is, first of all, if I can just give a few chains of transmission, athletes can go back to high school the next day. And if they've caught COVID from someone on the other team, they can spread it to other kids in their high school. The kids in the high school they spread it to can go home and spread it to their parents. They can spread it to their siblings and other family members. And any of the above, when they go to the grocery store or the doctor, which were still places where people went to even during the lockdown, and restaurants and workplaces, can spread it to other people. None of these people consented. That's why I call them collateral damage. And this is exacerbated by the very poor compliance with mask and social distance mandates throughout the pandemic. And again, I don't know how universally true this is for the whole US, but I know that in my particular area, it was very, very poor. Another source of infection that again, I call collateral damage is traveling to games. I mean, high school sport means a varsity sport where teams play teams from other towns. That involves traveling to other towns. And good epidemiological practice means making sure you confine anyone who's infected to a small area. That's why we had lockdowns. That's why we had stay-at-home orders. Well, what happens when you play a team from a town 40, 50 miles away is you travel there and you run the risk of infecting and being infected by people from another town. So do the traveling fans. So do the people who work at the concession stands. So do the traveling fans when they go to gas stations and restaurants in the town that they visit. So rather than confining the virus to your own area, you're running the risk of spreading it and bringing it back to your area. One bizarre thing that happened round about in the summer, and I'm sure this happened, that you are aware of this as well, is there's some people said, well, we shouldn't really have restrictions because if we do have restrictions on high school sport, there's the risk of what rogue athletes and rogue teams are going to do. What I mean by rogue teams is in Michigan, the state was divided into several areas depending on the extent of the spread of the virus. And people from my area that was considered to be pretty high risk, what some soccer teams did was they would travel to local soccer teams from mid-Michigan where I live, would travel to northern Michigan where there was a lower level of restriction. And they would play in a place like Traverse City, completely violating the whole point of trying to confine the virus to small defined areas. And another phenomenon that happened was we had some basketball players who were told, well, you can't practice because, you know, indoor sport is a very dangerous place. What they did was they traveled to tournaments in Indiana. So I'm sorry, the state where you're located in, but Indiana had fewer restrictions. And so that's where people from Michigan, it kind of reminds me of COVID tourism, where people travel to other states so they could go to restaurants when they couldn't go to restaurants in their home state. And these are all very undesirable things. Well, my point would be that the danger of rogue actions should not stop us from performing restrictions that are designed to make us all safer. So I think that the moral blame should be on the rogues rather than on the restrictions there. So I know I don't want to run on too long. I want to give the others of you a chance to speak as well. Let me just quickly get to my conclusion, which is, I mean, the subtitle for my conclusion is "The Devil is in the Details." And it seems to me very important that we talk about what restrictions are appropriate. And it's always, I think, important to impose the least restrictions you need to keep us safe. Often, I think when it came to football and other outdoor sports, I think Michigan did pretty well, keeping it to athletes had to wear face masks. There could be very few fans there. These are pretty good restrictions. But it seems to me there are times when the COVID level is so high in any given town, you've just got to stop sport. And Michigan did indeed do that. So it seems to me that that's going to be the, those are the two types of restrictions, either a complete ban or restrictions that at least minimize the risk of spread. The extent of the risk, of course, is somewhat uncertain. And we have to make decisions behind a veil of uncertainty. But it seems to me, behind a veil of ignorance, that we need to use the precautionary principle in cases like this and say, when a harm is catastrophically bad, even though we're not certain that the harm is going to happen, what we need to do is to take precautions against it happening. That's why every time I drive, I wear a seatbelt, even though I know the chance of my being in an accident any given time I drive are, microscopically small, but I still wear my seatbelt because the harm could be so horrible. Well, I think a similar thing applies to COVID. It is a fatal disease. 1 to 3% of people who have gotten it worldwide have died from it. And it seems to me because of that, even though we're not certain of the exact risks, it behooves us to be very, very careful. I think we need to consider the costs of restricting or banning high school sports. This was all too evident when people protested. There are psychic costs, even physical costs, you could say, but certainly psychic costs. You probably heard about the mother from Illinois who sued the governor because her son, who was a high school football player, killed himself. And he was very depressed about not playing football. That's a horrible situation. And while, I totally sympathize with a poor woman whose kid died, it seems to me that the risk of somebody suffering terribly is far greater from someone whose loved one dies of COVID. It seems to me that the psychic damage that is done by COVID is way greater than the psychic damage that is done by not being able to play sport for effectively a few weeks. The one thing I do want to mention just before I close, because I want to give the others a chance, is my argument is essentially a cost-benefit analysis. I cut it rather short at the end, but that's okay, because then you've got the gist of it. And a cost-benefit analysis is largely utilitarian. And some people are going to say, all you're doing is you're violating my right to play sport in order to promote a public good. And that's not fair. And especially fundamental rights are things that trump public goods. That's the defining feature of what a right is. And what I say to that is that I don't think we can really plausibly claim that the right to play sport, much as we've written about that a bit, is not a fundamental right. It seems to me that a fundamental right is defined as something that is essential to living a good life. And I think that someone can live a good life without playing sport, especially when it's only for a few weeks. Seems to me that it can be trumped by the urgent social need to control COVID. And furthermore, if anything is a fundamental right, it's freedom of religion, and we close down churches. So if that was a permissible restriction on a fundamental right for the sake of a public good, then surely restricting sport for the sake of a public good is also justifiable. Moreover, and this is I think a very important point, we shouldn't frame this as a debate between the right of people to play sport and, on the other hand, the public good of preventing COVID spread. There are two competing sets of rights here. It is perhaps my right to play sport, but it is the right to life of other people whose lives are endangered by my playing sport. So I think what we have here are two sets of competing rights. And frankly, the right to life that somebody else has is way more important than my right to sport. So, sorry, I went a little bit too long there, but I'll pass it over to the next person.
Oh, it's really wonderful, Nick. I have a lot of questions for you, as I'm sure the other members of the panel and the other guests here do. But yeah, we're going to move right to Chad Carlson.
Thanks, Kevin. And thanks, Nick and Jeff. Really appreciate being a part of this with you guys. If I stumble through what I'm saying early on, it's only because I'm processing what Nick has said, as I always do. Very clear, very logical, very well thought out. So the chapter that I did had to do with specifically the Big Ten's decision to cancel football a football season for 2020, and then actually reverse that decision a few weeks later and actually have a football season. And so that occurred right around this time of year. In fact, it was a couple of weeks before, and this is actually a great time of year to be talking about college sport with the overlap of the fall season and the winter season. So despite my own being a basketball guy and speaking here to all of you in Indiana, a basketball state, I'd like to talk a little bit about football, specifically college football here. And so that was the focus of my chapter. Like Nick said, largely this was written pre-vaccine, or at least the groundwork before the writing was pre-vaccine. And so yet I think some of the ethical issues remain here in terms of consistency, what we're trying to find. That was kind of one of my angles here is what's consistent related to the Big Ten deciding to, first of all, not have a season, and second of all, have a season. So in the fall of 2020, in Division I football, the highest level, 127 of the 130 teams had a fall season. That is, all but 3 teams decided that they were going to have their football teams play a fall season. For Division II, one step below that, Division II NCAA schools, only 9 out of 162 teams actually played a season. And in Division III, where my institution is and Nick's institution, 0 schools out of the 250 across the country that have football teams played in the fall. So this sort of begs a question coming from skepticism, and that is, does Division I play a different type of football that's maybe less inclined, that's more immune from COVID? Of course, the answer to that is no. What happens between the lines is the same at every level. And so there must be some other factor outside of the actual game of football. Nick mentioned the fact that football is a contact sport, and therefore individuals are in close contact with each other, sharing the same space, breathing on each other, which would make the sport more dangerous related to COVID. And yet everybody's playing it the exact same way. Why is it that we have the Division I teams playing, Division II and Division III teams not playing? There must be something going on beyond the actual sport, what's going on in the sport. So what were the other factors? Clearly money was a factor, finances were, and I discussed this in my chapter. I'll talk about that in just a minute. The way that the NCAA often presents their decisions related to ethical dilemmas, and the way that the Big Ten and the Big Ten schools presented their response had health and safety as the main concern, health and safety of the student athletes first and foremost. So what happened between the time when they decided to cancel their season in early August and when they decided to reinstate the season in mid-September had to do with what they believed was a fundamental change, or 2 fundamental changes in the health and safety of the football players at the Big Ten schools. So 2 things became available. Number 1, daily rapid response antigen testing, and the agreement among all 14 Big Ten teams to have their football players and all support staff, coaches, equipment folks, everybody working with the team, go through that testing every single day throughout the season, as well as an understanding of the benefits of myocarditis screening towards all those athletes. So the extreme examples of people within the demographic of 18 to 22-year-olds who were very physically active, who were from a performance standpoint in great shape. The difficulties came when there were underlying myocarditis issues. And so screening occurred for all the athletes. These were 2 things that changed between early August and mid-September that made the Big Ten change its mind. I think they wanted to follow what Nick was saying, which is, the least restrictive way forward would be the best. So at that point in time, from mid-September on, the season started in mid to late October. The belief was that the players would be safe theoretically if they undergo testing every day, and if that testing is reliable, and if they've had myocarditis screening, then players would be safe, and therefore when they're going to play other teams, the other teams would be following those same protocols, and therefore all players coming on the field at the moment when they come on the field, there's a really good chance that none of them have COVID and wouldn't be spreading it without the consent or without any of the other details that Nick mentioned, and I won't go over again. So it seemed like that was something that sort of assuaged some of the fears of health and safety of the athletes. Now the difficulty comes with the fact that this costs money, and it's a scarce resource. The testing kits that we had, the ability to do screening. These are scarce resources, and they cost money. So there's a fundamental reason why high schools can't do this. Obviously the costs are high schools are unable to pay for those things. Colleges, at least the Big Ten universities, which deal with large budgets, believe that they did have the ability to pay for those things. And yet how we distribute our resources became an issue from that point on. So I want to talk a little bit about that, sort of the distribution of resources and how COVID affected that, specific to Big Ten football. So using these resources costs money, and quite a bit of money, and a lot of resources. But having football at most Big Ten schools makes money. Not all of them, but at most schools, the football programs bring in a lot of money for the athletic department. And so when football makes a net profit, generally speaking, the entire athletic department therefore makes a net profit, and that money goes to support other athletics programs, at least in the Big Ten and the other schools, mostly all of whom are from Power 5 conferences, that do make money. And it's really only a handful. It's a growing handful, despite some skepticism related to accounting practices. If the school makes money off athletics, that money generally goes back to athletics to support the other programs. So what that means for other stakeholders, so we have the football players, the student athletes that may have been the primary stakeholder, and then we have other student athletes on campus from other teams. They stand to benefit from their school in the Big Ten having a football season. Money comes in. It's not as much as normal because there's no money coming in from tickets. They're not selling tickets. They're not having fans in the stadium, so they're not benefiting that way. But the television contracts are such that brings in enough money that it would help to support other teams on those campuses. So it seems like that helps in certain ways. Now, if we step below the Big Ten or below the Power 5 conferences to the Group of 5 conferences, of which Ball State is a part, Ball State, I think the football team loses maybe a couple $1 million a year. And so I'm happy to, I don't know if Jeff or Kevin, you guys can speak to that, but I'm sort of speaking from a place of some sort of knowledge related to statistics that are available. So Ball State relies heavily on student fees that go directly to support the athletics program in a way that Big Ten schools do not. So this would be a totally different financial consideration if we're dealing with a non-Big Ten or non-Power 5 school where most of the schools in a particular conference don't actually make money on athletics, or the football programs don't end up in the black because of the ways that students who are not athletes subsidize the athletic programs. So it'd be very different. That would actually cancel the financial implications of all of this. So if we were at Ball State, that probably actually isn't a good financial decision to continue to have football. It's broader than that. It's more detailed than that. But there's a difference there between the schools that make money, the conferences in which most schools make money, and the conferences in which most schools don't make money. So what about the students at these universities who are not athletes, and as well as the communities in general? How does this affect them as stakeholders? It seems that without fans coming to games, and this was somewhat unique to the Big Ten, not wholly unique, but there were a number of conferences, specifically with states in the South, who allowed certain capacities at their games. Big Ten did not allow fans at their games other than, I believe, parents and immediate relatives. So without fans coming to games, we're not transmitting or possibly transmitting COVID from people who are not being tested daily to other areas where it would spread in those ways. So it seems like the communities wouldn't be at greater risk as long as the team that's coming, and the team is, we believe, relatively isolated from COVID, isn't spending a lot of time in the community where they're visiting. So even though communities stand to profit financially, generally quite a bit from hosting home football weekends, they would generally remain relatively safe from because of the ways in which the Big Ten administered the season. It's a little bit more complex, not that that isn't complex, but a little bit more complex when we talk about the students at the particular schools, the students who are not athletes, the student body at large. There were anecdotal reports from a number of Big Ten university cities during the fall of 2020, the football season of 2020, who believed that they were symptomatic or had to be tested for reasons to be able to do certain things and needed to prove that they did not have COVID, who had a really hard time obtaining testing kits, or would go to medical clinics and wouldn't be allowed to get test kits, in part because there were shortages all over the place. Meanwhile, the football players are being tested every day, along with all the support staff. So this seems like a bit of an injustice that we're not distributing these scarce resources well. We don't have perfect evidence that this was actually the case in a way that should alarm us to change our thinking related to whether Big Ten schools should have had football during the fall of 2020 or not. We don't have evidence. We don't know exactly how much money different communities sunk into COVID testing, nor do we know exactly how much the schools spent on that. I imagine data may be available at some point in time. I couldn't find it as of the writing of this chapter. So we don't know for sure how much this negatively impacted students. We hear anecdotal evidence, but sometimes the media portrays that in a way that gets readers to read, as opposed to actually finding true evidence. So I don't know if that's if we have enough evidence to be able to have that be central to our decision. So these and other inequities on college campuses, specifically those with Division I athletic programs and football at the Division I level, are not new. Inequities or injustices between what student athletes receive, specifically football players, and what students who are not athletes receive. This is nothing new. COVID merely disclosed these inequities in more obvious ways. So I find that it's really hard to point to COVID and say COVID is the reason for some of these injustices. This is just an example of another injustice among others. And there were plenty of others that have always occurred at college campuses, but in the different cultural settings related to COVID, this was amplified. This became disclosed in more obvious ways. And that should give us pause related to whether the Big Ten should have had a football season or not. I argue that inequities were present before COVID, inequities were present during COVID, inequities were present after COVID. And so that isn't a reason for why we should say the Big Ten should not have had a season. The last issue that I discussed in this chapter has to do with coercion. There were certainly pressures for the Big Ten to play. And the reason why this is important is because, like I said at the beginning, the Big Ten decided, first of all, that they were not going to have a season and thought that the other 4 Power 5 conferences would have followed suit. Only one of them did, the Pac-12, the other 3 did not. And so there was pressure for them to begin a season after the ACC, the SEC, and the Big 12 began their season. People were watching. COVID occurred with some of those programs in higher and lower numbers, but they continued to play. Fans watched. Fans love watching football. And so the Big Ten felt some pressure to play. The players, by and large, but not to a person, indicated through social media that they wanted to play. The coaches wanted to coach, and the fans wanted to watch. So coercion only occurs if an entity is forced to do something, and there appears to be no other option. I refer to the work that Bob Simon has done in his book called Fair Play on sports ethics, that soft coercion actually might be at play here, might be something that matters, that there's not actually a gun to the head of the athlete saying you need to play or else, or to the school saying you need to have a football season or else, but there is some pressure. So it doesn't seem to be the case that the Big Ten schools were coerced into having a season. They could make a decision on their own. It was a unified group. Even if they had some discrepancy, it was a group, it was a conference. And so they made decisions like that together. And they very well could have continued on without a season. The pressures coming from the other conferences likely wouldn't have, it would not have helped the other conferences necessarily for the Big Ten to have a season. In fact, when it comes to market share and their prominence and a future legacy, I suppose, in the sport of football, it may have actually been better if the Big Ten hadn't had a season. So there wouldn't have been coercion coming from those other conferences. That just doesn't seem to meet the level of what coercion is. But pressure still existed. Most schools in NCAA Division I are part of a conference and are part of the NCAA. And there's still some pressure then for a particular school to do something related to what its conference would like it to do. And there might be, excuse me, I just swallowed a fly. I've never had that happen in November before. I apologize. So there were pressures, but it felt more like a peer pressure That is a pressure to do something because everyone else is doing that particular thing. Peer pressure isn't in itself indefensible coercion or otherwise ethically indefensible on its own. It does constrain one's freedom, but I don't think it does in a way in this situation that violates ethical principles. The Big Ten as a conference and the Big Ten institutions very well could have said, no, we don't want to have a season. And that would have been fine. That would have been costly in some ways. But I think considering the health and safety, which they believed met a threshold that was safe for the student athletes with football, and the financial implications at Big Ten schools in the sense that it would help other teams to be able to have the budget that they wouldn't otherwise have without football, led me to the conclusion that I think it was justified for the Big Ten to have a particular season. Ready to pass along, Kevin.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Chad. I saw that fly, by the way, for a second or so. It's a reminder that, we humans aren't alone in the world. Perhaps also a reminder of what happened to Mike Pence in that vice presidential debate a few years back. Mike Pence actually was once the representative of our district here, so he's a notable person around here, but we won't speak about that further. We'll just pass it on to the founder of Big Questions, Big Ideas, Jeff Fry from Ball State.
Well, thank you, Chad and Nick. Really interesting presentations, and thanks to Kevin for facilitating this, and also to Joe at the Kennedy Library. So my chapter also focused on the reinstatement of sport in the late summer and fall of 2020. And I raised a number of considerations in the chapter about why I think that suspension of sports during that time was justified and was really the right thing to do. And I do think probably the arguments would have significant force up until the time of when vaccinations became widely available and frequent testing. But I'm not going to go through the litany of those arguments for the suspension of sports. Instead, I'm going to focus on a small part of this chapter and actually look at some arguments for the early reinstatement of sports. And I want to explain why I think those arguments were not decisive. And the three arguments are: one, that sports are inherently dangerous. So COVID doesn't add anything qualitatively new. Second, that sport is central to the mission of colleges and educational institutions, including colleges and universities. So if you're going to reinstate education, then you should reinstate sport. And the third has to do with other deleterious effects that could result from suspending sports. So first of all, then, sports are inherently dangerous. Proponents of the reinstatement of sports during the late summer and autumn of 2020 were not bereft of arguments or potential arguments in support of their position. Versions of the arguments that follow either were offered or could have been made in support of an early reinstatement of sports in high schools, colleges, and universities. And first one is this argument that sports are inherently dangerous. Reinstatement of close contact team sports in high schools, colleges, and universities arguably posed a danger to the health of participants on the basis of the possibility of contracting COVID-19. However, some might respond to this claim by arguing that sports are inherently dangerous, and thus, given the inherent riskiness of sports, the addition of COVID-19 would not have introduced a qualitatively new risk factor into sport. But what I want to ask is, should we accept the premise of this argument? Are all sports inherently dangerous? John Russell, philosopher, designates dangerous sports in the following way. This is a quotation. By dangerous sport, I mean a sport that involves activity that itself creates a significant risk of loss of or serious impairment to some basic capacity for human functioning, end quote. That being said, he distinguishes between dangerous and non-dangerous sports. In dangerous sports, he claims that the impairment is expected occasionally, even given protective measures. In non-dangerous sports, protective measures more or less assure safety. And based on those qualifications, he takes the following to be some exemplars of dangerous sports: baseball, cricket, boxing, football, downhill skiing, gymnastics, marathon running, and mountain climbing. and as for some exemplars of non-dangerous sports, golf, bowling, and billiards. So perhaps then not all sports are inherently dangerous. Certainly some are more dangerous than others, but it's fair to say that most, if not all, sports involve an element of risk to physical safety. But even if we were to concede that sports are inherently dangerous, or at least some high school and collegiate sports are so, one might argue that some sports are already too dangerous prior to adding COVID-19 into the mix of factors. For example, due to many injuries associated with American football, including concussions, some have raised serious challenges to the continued existence of the sport or called for significant reforms. But setting aside debates about the specific merits of football, surely at some point, sport crosses a threshold such that the dangerousness of the sport is excessive. Few people would endorse a no-holds-barred organized sport of mayhem at the high school or collegiate level. Nevertheless, some applaud the presence of significant risk associated with playing sports. Indeed, John Russell argues that there is a particular value associated with participation in dangerous sports. And this is what he calls self-affirmation that comes from testing oneself at the limits of one's being. It's often claimed that sports are laboratories for developing and exhibiting grit and courage. But the risk of contracting and spreading COVID-19 are not risks inherent to sports competitions or to exhibiting the excellences or internal goods of sports. Instead, COVID-19 potentially injects a kind of bad luck into sport that undermines the possibility of good athletic contest. And I refer you to a paper by our colleague Nick Dixon on failed athletic contests and the role that luck can play in those. Most noteworthy are instances where COVID-19 outbreaks have prevented the occurrence of competitions. One might reply that in order to play sports, one must already undertake risks that are not inherent to sporting activity. These include risks incurred during team travel to athletic venues, travel that also puts non-participants at risk. But given the current environmental crisis, one could argue for the curtailment of lengthy and especially cross-country and international travel to participate in sports. And perhaps at some level of accident occurrence, we might curtail travel on the basis of traffic safety considerations. Finally, since travel often entails close contact with others, travel during the pandemic is an occasion for contracting or spreading the virus, as Nick mentioned. One might nevertheless argue that the reinstatement of team sports in the late summer and autumn of 2020 represented respect for the autonomous decisions of athletes, many who lobbied for resumption of play. In response, I offer two thoughts. First, due to the age range of the athletes in question and what was widely known about COVID-19, there is a question as to how many of the athletes could have made decisions based on informed consent. Were the risks only moderately increased, or were they more like those incurred in base jumping? How could one know? During the fall of 2020, there were still many unknowns regarding COVID-19, and perhaps a form of soft paternalism was justified based on unknown factors about the virus. Second, a decision not to reinstate sports would not have prohibited athletes from engaging in sporting activities. Instead, the decision would have suspended high school and intercollegiate sports in this organized form for a finite period of time. So that is the first argument in response to that argument. A second potential argument for the early reinstatement of high school and college sports involves the claim that sports are central to the mission of educational institutions, and thus if face-to-face education reconvenes, so too should have organized team sports. Peter Finch points out that numerous universities include in their mission statements the claim that service to the community is a component of the university's mission. And thus one could argue that athletics programs help fulfill this aspect of the university's mission by providing entertainment for the community. But one might still question whether entertainment comprises part of the core mission of educational institutions. And furthermore, there were numerous venues that were dedicated to entertainment, but which did curtail or suspend the hosting of activities during the pandemic. These included Broadway theaters and live music venues. A second, more narrowly construed interpretation of the mission of educational institutions views their core mission as that of the dissemination of knowledge. Does sport comport with this narrower sense of the mission of educational institutions? Former NCAA President Miles Brand, who was by training a philosopher, argued that it does. According to Brand, quote, when the educational experience of student athletes is compared with those studying the performing arts, such as music, dance, and theater, as well as the studio arts, it is difficult to find substantive differences, end quote. In addition, Bob Simon and his co-authors suggest that sports fulfill the more narrowly construed mission of universities by providing opportunities for the acquisition of self-knowledge and cognitive skill development. And first, in response to this, I would raise two considerations. First, it's still debated whether face-to-face instruction itself should have been reinstated in the late summer and autumn of 2020. During the pandemic, some teachers threatened to strike in the United States due to fear for their safety. Among chief concerns was access to safe classrooms and buildings, and not least, vaccines. Some college professors decried the lack of autonomy in determining the mode of content delivery of their courses. So it was not settled opinion that face-to-face instruction was the all things considered best option. Second, educational institutions had in principle the option of virtual classrooms and hybrid models of education that do not require physical contact. This represented a significant difference from many organized sporting competitions. And third, where face-to-face instruction was reinstated, there was in principle the ability to institute measures such as mask wearing and social distancing. When it came to contact sports, masks were typically not worn in competition. And when they were worn, such as on the sidelines, they were worn inconsistently and haphazardly by both athletes and coaches. And finally, the very idea of contact sport belies any pretense that athletes would observe social distancing. The third argument has to do, however, with some further deleterious effects from suspending high school and college sports. Would the cost have been too high? No doubt these suspensions, where they occurred, led to significant disappointment. Athletes would miss the camaraderie brought about by friendships forged on the playing fields. The suspension of sports would have frustrated the desire for competition. The suspension of organized sports might have curtailed athletes' success of receiving future offers of athletic scholarships and professional contracts by virtue of losing the opportunity to showcase their talents. As a result of suspension of sports, athletes, support staff, and fans would have lost opportunities to create meaningful memories they might have revisited throughout their lives, which would have in some cases brought joy and inspiration. As an effect of these losses, athletes might have experienced mental health deficits. These are real losses. However, it's also the case that most people were required to make sacrifices during the pandemic. The participants in high school and intercollegiate sports warrant a privileged position or an exception afforded to essential workers. The reinstatement of sports not only entailed risks, but also pressure on health resources, such as by frequent testing, the requirement of frequent testing. Perhaps there were ways to mitigate the losses incurred from the suspension of organized team sports. What was called for was creative thinking linked to active measures to stem the losses. The implementation of some creative approaches, while admittedly far from being ideal substitutes for competition, might have reduced those losses. For example, sports schedules might have been reshuffled, with autumn sports competitions rescheduled for the spring and summer of 2021, or until such a time as circumstances warranted. Vaccines were sorely needed. The presence of vaccines would have significantly ameliorated the situation. In the meantime, coaches might have adopted measures to mitigate skill erosion, enhance skill development and maintain fitness levels, promote athletes' visibility, and buoy their spirits. Coaches might have met individually with athletes or with small groups in order to promote skill development. They might have adapted new forms of competition and held online meetings with athletes to review film and discuss best strategies and practices. To enhance athletes' abilities, the coaching staff could have produced and distributed tapes of individual athletes doing individual workouts. And in addition, school counselors could have been made available for online consultation with athletes in proactive anticipation of mental health concerns. Both athletes and coaches refer to resilience and to how overcoming adversity is central to sport. And in the late summer and autumn of 2020, athletes faced a real test of adversity. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Jeff Fry. We now have some time for questions and conversations. I will ask the other participants in the Zoom call here to use the hand raise button if you have a question. If you don't prefer to voice the question out loud yourself, please feel free to type it into the chat and I will represent your question to the panelists. I'm going to start with a question of my own for Nick. The question is partly a gloss on one of the arguments you made in the middle of your talk, Nick, that kind of shades into a general question about ethical reasoning in a time of pandemic. What strikes me, and I was kind of anticipating as you were running through this argument, that the risk argument wasn't going to work because we're dealing with disease here, and disease isn't properly assessed in terms of risk. And the rationale that I would give for this is different than what you said, but it's compatible with it. And this really comes from my new COVID experience in the historiography of disease. I'm a philosopher of history. And when I started studying the historiography of disease a few years ago, what really struck me is how our historical models and most of what we learn in the philosophy of history or in historiography don't work in the case of disease, because they're all constructed on the basis of the study of action and agency. And I think something similar is true, perhaps less so, of ethical reasoning. But it seems to me that risk is inherently is a concept that's intrinsically related to agency and action, and that diseases are not about agency and action. That, or to the extent that they are about agency or action, the actors are entities quite different from ourselves. So I just want to ask you a general question about doing the kind of work that you do as an ethical theorist who studies sport. Sport, of course, is a human activity loaded with, ripe with ethical quandaries, ethical dilemmas. But pandemics are quite different types of events, and diseases are quite different types of entities than the things we would normally reason about in sports. So what problems confront you in reasoning about pandemic? What type of stress does disease really put on the categories of ethical reasoning, such as you do it?
Well, I don't think it. I think the same general principles that I apply to any ethical issue in sport, not during a pandemic, do apply. I just think the pandemic adds enormously important new empirical circumstances that change the kind of assessment. And I think that one of the things that I mentioned, I think, is very pertinent to the uniqueness of pandemics that you just pointed out, and that is that a lot of actions in sport really don't affect that many people. Normally, my actions on the playing field will only impact my opponents, and maybe they'll impact fans, but not in a particularly, direct way. But when it comes to this pandemic, it's because it is a pandemic that it can have far-reaching effects, and that's my main argument in favor of restrictions.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I love that, and thank you very much, for the wonderful presentation and the reply. Chad, I really appreciated the argument that you give, and this was also something I was waiting for as you were discussing the economics of sports at a school like Ball State University. Ball State University has a Division I football team, but it is a Division I football team that loses money in most years. I certainly don't. I don't know about Jeff or Adam or Elizabeth, the other Ball State employees on the call. I don't want to represent numbers because I don't follow those things on a yearly basis, but in most years we lose significant money. And this is something that students are aware of, at least the students that I mostly talk to who are students in philosophy classes. So I frequently hear the argument from students these days that there's an inequity involved in staging a Division I football team at a public university. Because they come here for the education. This is the public education that is available to them. But funding a football program is a part of it that they didn't choose, right? So they see some injustices in that, and I'm sympathetic with that argument. But I just wanted to ask you to narrow on this. I also appreciate the point that you make that the pandemic context really highlights injustices that exist elsewhere. and, you know, so anything that we could study about the pandemic, you know, race, economic inequality, all these things, we will find out that there were existing injustices and existing, at the very least, inequities, and the pandemic highlighted them. So it's just like, how strong do you see this kind of anti-football argument, collegiate sport argument being, how strong do you perceive it to be in the first place? How do you perceive it to be amplified in the pandemic, by the pandemic?
Sure. The institution where I worked before I came to Hope College was Eastern Illinois University, very similar to Ball State. And we heard the same things. I think it's really, really difficult to justify charging students, all students, a fee that goes to support an athletic program that does not on its own make money. It's a really difficult thing. And Ball State is certainly not alone. Eastern Illinois is with them. And there's a professor at George Mason, professor of public policy, I'm trying to blank on his name, who's written really clearly about this recently, about the injustices that occur there. And students are becoming more aware. You're right. And they well ought to be. So the fact that my chapter was about the Big Ten's decision made the economics of all of this a lot different than had it been sort of across the board Division I. It made sense that the SEC, who derive much of their goodwill from football and from fans from all across each of those states coming to support those teams. I mean, that's a way of life there in a way that I think we believe in Big Ten country we mirror, but maybe I think don't understand the fullness of. So there's a lot of goods that come from that. And the Big Ten derives a lot of those goods as well. You know, financially, the Big Ten is in even a better position than the SEC and the other Power 5 schools with the television contract, the way in which that pays money to each school. So that makes a difference in my mind, because that helps support the other teams, you know, from the non-revenue generating sports. The question still remains, though, that there are still tons of inequities between what student athletes receive and what the rest of the students receive, even on Big Ten campuses. And those, like I said, have been amplified, further disclosed through COVID. And I think those are worth discussing. But all other things equal, this wasn't anything new in COVID. And so having a football season during COVID just exposed some of these injustices or inequities, even within Big Ten schools, from, you know, the bandwidth of the economics that Ohio State receives in response to their football team being very good, and what Rutgers receives to their team struggling most years is certainly an inequity. That's a different type of inequity, but those exist. And I think students are learning more about those. I think students, I hope that they continue to explore those, because I think there are injustices there. Absolutely, there are.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Chad. I want to concede the floor to Adam Bowen, the White Sox fan.
All right. Well, I have questions and comments for all of you, but I'm going to start with my colleague Jeff, and I want you, and then we can go back if other people have questions. I have one I wrote out for Nick Dixon, but so Jeff, you end with a sort of a rebuttal from overcoming adversity, right? That's part of sport, and there was other avenues besides just opening up all the sports participation. And at least on college campuses, there's the big elephant in the room is that we were dealing with reduced revenue, right? Like, we were all being told that, you know, there would be no merit raises and things like that. So a lot of the resources required to overcome the adversity by individually filming athletes and, you know, individually counseling athletes, that's a lot of resources that the university was already cutting back on. So I'd like to hear more about how those considerations play into your proposal.
Well, yeah, I'm assuming that some of those resources were probably already available and had been used in the past. And it might have required more creativity than I let on would be required in order to get some of that done. But some of it wouldn't meeting individually with athletes doesn't require those technological resources, certainly, or in small groups, that kind of thing. But I think even at the high school level these days, taping games is not, it's kind of common fare. So I don't think that that level of technology is really would be that much of a stretch. Now, if you suggest that maybe things were so bad they should be selling off that technology and investing that money into other aspects of the educational institutions, well, that, you know, I don't know. Maybe there's an argument to be made there. But that would be my initial response. But I'd be happy to hear more what you think about that.
Yeah, I'm also thinking that a lot of the individuals employed in those various roles would probably have retained their employment even if they weren't doing the same tasks, right? So like the film guy that normally would tape the whole practice, he would have that opportunity, but I would think that would be a lot more time if all the players were having individual practices. That was sort of I latched on to that one example because it's like, yeah, how do you learn and how do you keep on improving your sport? Because that would have been one deficit from missing out on practice. Now they're all having individual practices and the coaches are spread pretty thin.
But I'm guessing that some of that did take place, that this is not just what would have been a possible approach, but I'm guessing that it did take place.
Thank you. Yeah. It was a small worry, but it was one I wanted to hear you say more about. So thank you.
Kevin, can I respond to your just add something to your question to Nick?
You of course can.
One of the reasons I want to respond is because my paper is actually about risk and about various kinds of risk, and that wasn't really the focus of what I talked about tonight. But I wanted to push back a little bit on your point about disease not having to do with agency and action. And I think actually in the case of the pandemic, agency has been a big deal. People are talking about their freedom to take risks to contract COVID if they want to, if that's what they want to do. So I would push back a little bit on that.
Yeah, so I'm going to concede to Nick, who no doubt will give a better analysis of it. However, yeah, my prima facie response is that I think these people are wrongly phrasing the issues when they talk about risk, for the very reason that diseases spread for the most part unbeknownst to us. We know that we're contributing to the spread of them. Therefore, like, we could have an obligation, to wear masks, to isolate and things like that. But when I wear my mask, I'm not looking to protect myself. When I wear my mask, or when I socially distance, or when I get takeout instead of eating in the restaurant, I'm trying to contribute to something which is much bigger, which is like a downward move of the curve. I'm not trying to prevent myself from contracting to it, right? From contracting the disease itself. Although I might also be doing that, and you might think of it in terms of that. I tend not to think of it in terms of that, and I tend to think that it's wrong-headed in order to do so, because risk seems to me to be a concept that's oriented about the relationship between an action and the effects of the action on the actor, and diseases. Diseases just don't work like that, right? If I disobey all the COVID protocols, there's a good chance still that I won't get sick, but I might contribute, at least statistically, to the further spread of disease that will kill someone off somewhere down the line, right? So I mean, there's a type of risk in there, but it's a statistical risk rather than an individual risk. That would be my, I hadn't thought about this before tonight, Jeff. So that's just my first response. And I've been telling people for about 1.5 years when they give me these things, well, it's my right to not wear a mask. It's my right to risk my own safety. And I said, well, this has nothing to do with your safety. This has something to do with the collective action to try to reduce the transmission of a virus, so that we also reduce the number of people who get sick. So we also reduce the number of people who die. And if you're thinking about this in terms of the effects of your action on yourself, then you're thinking about it in a wrong way. But I'm sure Nick's answer will be better than mine. No pressure.
Yeah. Well, actually, I think I would, I've got a cat that's attacking me now. I think that my response actually would be very similar to what Jeff has already said. It seems to me that the debate that happened and maybe continues to happen in sport about the rights of athletes and the people whose lives are negatively impacted by restrictions, and on the other hand, the need to protect society, is precisely the debate we're having in society at large. From the people who believe that, what we're currently talking about with vaccine requirements. In Britain, they're requiring that by April the 1st of next year, all healthcare workers must be fully vaccinated. I mean, that requirement is pretty straightforwardly. It appears to be a conflict between, individual autonomy, and some people, for various reasons, maybe it's health-related reasons, religious reasons, or beliefs about risks of vaccines, are opposed to having vaccinations, and yet the utilitarian argument in favor of doing this for the benefit of society is enormous. And what I would add, by the way, is that, as I said right at the end of my presentation, I do think that it's a bit disingenuous when people present it as a conflict between my individual right to do as I please versus the utilitarian social policy goal of making society safe. We're also, of course, talking about the rights of other people not to lose their lives needlessly. So it seems to me that we have competing rights.
Very well said. Thank you for that. Adam, I do want to give you the chance to ask your questions to Chad and Nick, which you said you have. I mean, we've been going just over an hour now, so maybe we'll close it after that unless one of our other guests has a question. But please do ask your questions to Chad and Nick, and we'll let them answer.
All right, thank you. So I appreciate the extended utilitarian argument that you gave, Nick. And so given this harm argument, which you think is much stronger than the soft paternalism, which I agree, how much weight do you factor in the deterrent effectiveness of restrictions? So if the primary purpose of restrictions and mandates is to deter individuals, I mean, we're thinking as utilitarians, right, from engaging in behaviors that are likely to risk harm to others, then a weak deterrent value, if those restrictions really aren't that much of a deterrent, then it would weigh against the utilitarian judgment in favor of them. So I want to expand on that a little bit. So I think your rogue team example addresses this issue, right? They're traveling out of their areas and so forth. But it seems to presuppose that the preponderance of teams are abiding by the restrictions, and characterizes the rogues as sort of outliers. But, I live in Idaho, and I would predict that rogue status is far, and we have very few restrictions at all. And so we were seeing a huge influx of teams from Oregon and Washington, where there were lots of restrictions, playing high school sports in Idaho. Or like you said, Michigan teams going to Indiana in your example. So if rogue status is far greater than estimated, then one might argue that COVID sport restrictions for high school teams in the manner that you've represented not only have a negligible deterrent value as compared to the main deterrent, mainly not catching the disease, not dying from the disease, and not spreading it to your loved ones, but it also can possibly exacerbate the spread of contagion by serving as like an impetus to get teams to travel beyond the borders of their local mandates, beyond that reach. So yeah, I worry if, depending on how much we put deterrent as a value in the cost benefit analysis, then it might weigh against it. So I'd like to hear what you have to say about that.
No, that's a great consideration. I really like that. And I think that what this would call for, there's an interesting parallel in between the situation you were describing, and I had no idea that it went beyond Michigan. So I just learned something from you there. And what this, I think, calls for is a nationwide debate about not just having state. I understand this goes against the principle of states' autonomy, but it seems to me when you've got a pandemic, there does need to be talk about national restrictions. Other countries have done that. And what this parallels, by the way, is a completely different subject, but I think there's a similar phenomenon. It is where different states have different gun control restrictions. And so if I'm in a city or a state with very, very tight gun control and I want a gun, maybe for nefarious purposes, it's easy. I just, for example, if I'm in Chicago where it's virtually impossible to get a handgun, I just go out to the suburbs and I buy one there. Or if I'm in a state with tough controls, I just go to the next state that has less. So effectively, gun control in a country with a patchwork of different types of regulation is not very effective. And I think a similar thing applies to sport in COVID. And I would be very much in favor of national controls when it comes to national restrictions on all aspects of life, although I understand that's anathema to the belief in states' individual autonomy and cities' autonomy. I mean, my goodness, even in Florida, there is opposition, from individual cities to what the governor says, and also in liberal states, there is opposition from conservative cities. So it's a bit of a utopian dream I have, but yes, I do think that national standards will be a good idea.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, the federalism strikes again in the United States. Right? We like to maintain our state autonomy in lots of ways, and yeah, living in a state where living in Illinois, much more regulation, and then living in Indiana and Idaho, respectively, the far fewer restrictions on all the other issues, right? Guns, fireworks, things like that. So the only reason there's restrictions on fireworks in Idaho is because we have so much desert that's dry and forest. So it's all about fire prevention. It doesn't have, they're like, okay, well, in this case, we don't want to risk our own lives of having a fire next to our home. So I guess we'll admit to restrictions on fireworks, but not on firearms. Yeah.
Do you have a further question, Adam? Go for it.
For Chad, I did have it's an extension of what you were talking, the inequities you were talking about between Power 5 conferences and pretty much every other type of school, right? Boise State possibly makes money on their football program, even though they're not in a Power 5. But I mean, those examples are few and far between. But that's always existed. So the Power 5 conferences with their big TV contracts, with all the uniform sale, jersey sales and all sorts of things, but just mostly in football and basketball. Men's football and basketball make all the money for the NCAA, right? That's why the tournament's so huge. But that gets distributed. It's not just within schools, but the NCAA distributes a lot of that money from the big tournament, the basketball tournament, to all the sports programs across. I mean, how would we have swim teams? No one's watching swim meets. I mean, some people might, like swimmers that are like studying their opposition, but right, like so other student athletes get an opportunity to play at a high level and get an education at the same time. A lot of that's made possible by these sports playing, right? So given this argument, and I agree that the Big Ten schools had all the reason to have a season last year because of those reasons. But I wonder how the issue that continues to crop up and will continue to crop up about paying these moneymakers, right? So if the money's getting spread everywhere, how do we have room I know these are massive budgets, but how is there any room to compensate athletes further than room and board and full tuition? Like that. I mean, it's hard to see if the part of the role of the Big Five is to help every other sport out and every other program out, then we can't really afford, right? And that's probably the NCAA's argument. I just don't know how we could afford to pay these athletes, even if they are deserving.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I think this shows the complexity of really the college sport model that we currently have. It's educational, yes, but it's a business, especially at Division I, and yet the workers don't have particular rights. And I think what you're saying is probably should be the focus of Jeff's next edited anthology, which I'd love to contribute to, Jeff, just for the record. One of the ways in which this inequity has also become further exposed during COVID is that the moneymakers, men's basketball and football teams, are largely comprised of athletes who come from lower socioeconomic and non-white racial groups. And the athletes who benefit from the moneymakers making money for the universities tend to be less low in socioeconomics and more white. And so there's a racial issue at play there. And, one of the extra sort of add-on reasons for having a Big Ten football season is that you take a lot of young Black American men and you give them resources that many of them who came from low socioeconomic statuses would not have been able to receive from higher risk areas. And so that's sort of an add-on, but I think it shows the ways in which this inequity isn't just about one sport to another, that the demographics within those sports really matter as well. And so I think that's probably an argument that goes more towards the fact that we should be paying those who make the money, even though they're doing good without really having a say in where that money gets distributed. Adam, I will say you made a mistake here by wrapping this thing up. You asked us in the wrong order. I love listening to Nick, and I was hoping that you'd ask him last so he could send us off with these into a philosophical utopia. But you asked me, so maybe you should have one more question.
So no, Chad, I just want to follow up what you said, because you just recited another argument that's dear to my heart, and I make this argument to as many people whom I can find who might listen to it. And it is that we are using the labor of, for the most part, poor Black men who play basketball and football to fund the education and entertainment of, for the most part, upper middle class white women, because Title IX requires that we spend as much money on women's sports as on men's sport. And my issue was not with Title IX, but with the consequence on athletics and on the economics of athletics. But in order to compensate for that, we end up running sports such as women's field hockey, women's soccer, women's swimming, and these tend to be populated by white women of upper middle class backgrounds, right? So it is a tremendous injustice that actually takes place, even if a lot of the principles behind it are sound ones in some other contexts. So I'm glad you highlight that. I mean, I make that argument everywhere I can on campus, and these are arguments that that students are, as I said earlier, students are making themselves, right? Students understand the cost of education. And students understand the inequities involved in education. And they certainly understand how the pandemic has highlighted certain of these things for them. So I just want to thank all of you. I don't have like a brilliant close, except to say that this has been a very instructive hour and 20 minutes for me, as I'm sure it has been for Adam and Joe and Elizabeth and Jordan and Marlon. So thank you guys so much. You guys are welcome to Ball State anytime. Maybe when Jeff Fry gets this next edited volume together, I think Adam might be an available contributor if you're looking for for someone else then. So thank you guys on behalf of Big Questions, Big Ideas, Kennedy Library Reference Desk, and Ball State Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies.
All right.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you very much.
Hey, thanks very much. Great job.
It's great.
Thank you guys. That was a great panel. Appreciate
Good to
it.
see all of you.
Yeah, you too.
Okay. I'd like to express a thanks to all of Dr. Dixon, Dr. Carlson, and Dr. Fry for participating with us tonight. I'd like to thank everyone for watching this video a little bit later. Please join us for our next Big Questions, Big Ideas panel to be held in December 10th. We'll be discussing Racing Fargo, refugees, citizenship, and the transformation of small cities. Thank you very much, everyone, and have a good evening.